Centuries after the Great Flood, the Nephilim giants reappeared on the earth as if nothing had happened. The question that has challenged theologians and scholars for millennia is only one. How is this possible? If the flood was sent by God to purify the earth, why did the most corrupt beings walk among men again? It was taught for centuries that the flood sent by God exterminated every corrupt being upon the face of the earth. However, the Bible itself contradicts that narrative with a prediction that is impossible to ignore. The Nephilim, those beings of colossal stature and supernatural origin, survived somehow the universal catastrophe. And what is even more disturbing, they were seen again by human beings centuries after the waters receded. What secret does the biblical account hide that religious tradition has not been able to explain clearly? The answer is found in 3 different theories, and one of them could change everything you believed you knew about the flood. Before exploring those theories, it is necessary to understand who the Nephilim were and why their existence matters so much. The term Nephil appears in the book of Genesis with an economy of words that contrasts with its enormous significance. Some scholars translate the word Nephilim as those who fell or those who caused to fall, linking it with what is to come. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 describes them as beings who inhabited the earth both before and after the flood. That detail contained in barely a line of the sacred text is actually one of the most explosive statements in the Bible. The Nephilim were the result of the union between the sons of God, identified as angels, and human women. From that forbidden union giants were born, warriors of renown, beings who filled those who contemplated them with terror, and everything points to the fact that God sent the flood precisely to put an end to that corruption they represented. However, more than 500 years after the flood, the Nephilim appeared again in the biblical record. The episode occurs in one of the most critical moments in the history of the people of Israel. At the gates of Canaan, the Israelites, who had been enslaved in Egypt for 4 centuries, were finally marching toward the Promised Land. Moses then sent 12 men, one for each tribe, to secretly explore the territories they were to conquer. The episode is found in the book of Numbers when the Israelites sent spies to explore the land of Canaan. Those 12 men returned terrified with a report that would change the destiny of a whole people for 4 decades. Numbers chapter 13 verse 33 records the exact words of the spies. We saw the Nephilim there, descendants of Anak, and they added something that reveals the magnitude of what they contemplated. In comparison with them, we seemed like grasshoppers. That passage is not a metaphor or a literary exaggeration, but the testimony of 12 witnesses before a whole nation. 10 of the 12 spies returned convinced that the people of Israel could not face those giants and survive. Only Joshua and Caleb maintained confidence, but panic had already seized the masses and the damage was done. The giants were there in Canaan, centuries after the flood was supposed to have erased them from history. This poses a theological dilemma of the first magnitude. Did God's plan fail, or is there something we do not understand well? Was the flood a divine failure, or are we misinterpreting the scope of that catastrophic event? To answer that question, there are 3 hypotheses developed by recognized scholars of the scriptures. Each of them comes from a different intellectual tradition and offers a different solution to the same enigma. None is definitive, but together they reveal the depth of the problem and the seriousness with which experts have approached it. What they do share is the conviction that the Bible does not contain an irresolvable contradiction, but a mystery to decipher. The first theory has its origin in a text that was not included in the biblical canon, the Apocryphon of Genesis. This document was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century and dates from the period before Christ. It relates something that, if true, would completely redefine the story of Noah and the purpose of the flood. According to that text, Noah's own father doubted the paternity of his son even before he was born. The father reflected with anguish whether his wife's pregnancy had been the product of an angel or of the Nephilim themselves. The extraordinary appearance of the newborn with white hair and luminous eyes fed those suspicions. That description is not accidental, but reflects the belief that beings with angel blood had unusual features. The father then consulted the patriarch Enoch, who reassured him, but the doubt had been recorded forever. The single possibility that someone questioned the human origin of Noah reveals how much that fear weighed in ancient thought. This suggests that some thought Noah might have had angel ancestry, being partly Nephilim himself. If Noah carried that supernatural lineage in his blood, then the Nephilim never left the ark because they went inside, and their descendants, even without knowing it, would have carried that lineage and would have transmitted it to future generations. This hypothesis was formulated in the 1st century before Christ, and many experts consider it an alternative narrative. It is not the most likely explanation, but it reveals something fundamental. Already in antiquity, people knew that something did not add up. Even the men of the past perceived the contradiction of the return of the Nephilim and sought to explain it. The second hypothesis is more solid and comes from the linguistic analysis of the biblical account of the flood itself. The scholar Michael Heiser, doctor in biblical Hebrew and ancient Semitic languages, offers a revealing perspective. Heiser dedicated decades to the study of the supernatural background of the Old Testament from a rigorous academic perspective. His linguistic analysis of the Hebrew terms used in the account of the flood yields unexpected results. Genesis chapter 7 verse 19 affirms that the waters covered all the high mountains under heaven. An apparently total statement, however. Heiser argues that in biblical Hebrew the word all does not always imply an absolute totality. In the same way, the word world in the scriptures does not necessarily refer to the entire planet as we understand it today. Genesis chapter 41 verse 57 itself offers a clarifying example when it says that all the earth went to Egypt to buy grain. It is evident that not every human being on all continents physically traveled to Egypt to acquire food. The expression all the earth referred to the world known by the characters of the story, not to the complete globe. Applying that same logic to the account of the flood, it is possible that the waters covered only the inhabited region described, more specifically the world of the peoples and tribes mentioned in the Old Testament up to that narrative moment. If the flood was a regional and not a planetary event, then the Nephilim who lived in other regions would have survived. That regional interpretation of the flood has defenders and critics, and the academic debate continues to this day. Critics argue that if the flood was local, then God did not achieve his purpose of eradicating corruption. However, here arises a question that completely changes the approach to the problem and deserves to be considered with care. Was the purpose of the flood really to exterminate every Nephilim upon the face of all the earth without leaving any trace? Or was it simply to put an end to the rebellion, protect humanity, and deal a decisive blow to that threat? If the objective was to safeguard humanity from the corruption that the Nephilim generated, the flood fulfilled it more than enough. The majority was destroyed, the rebellion was crushed, and the scattered survivors no longer constituted an immediate threat. From Noah's perspective, inside the ark, the water reached as far as his eyes could see in all directions. For him, everything was submerged because everything he could observe from his position was effectively underwater. He had no maps, he had no global geographic references, nor any way of knowing what was happening thousands of kilometers away. What happened in distant and unknown continents was simply invisible and irrelevant to the occupants of the ark. This narrative perspective would explain how the text can be true without necessarily implying a planetary flood. The honesty of the biblical account could reside precisely in that it narrates the facts from the limited perspective of its protagonists. But it is the third theory that is most surprising, because it arises from a passage about something completely different. No one who reads the text for the first time would expect to find in that passage a key about the return of the Nephilim. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, talks about the custom of women covering their heads. In chapter 11, verse 10, Paul gives a reason for that practice that has baffled interpreters for centuries. He says that the woman must wear a sign of authority on her head and adds a cause that seems out of place because of the angels. What do angels have to do with the use of veils or coverings on the head during religious worship? To find the answer, it is necessary to resort to one of the manuscripts of the Dead Sea known as the Damascus document. That text, dated to the period of the Second Temple, speaks of angels called watchers who fell for desiring women. Their descendants, described as tall as cedars and with bodies as immense as mountains, are the Nephilim. The Damascus document suggests that this pattern, angels seduced by human women, was repeated after the flood. The scholar Troy Martin from Xavier University offers a linguistic interpretation that connects all this puzzle. According to Martin, the Greek term used by Paul for covering can also be interpreted as what covers or wraps. In ancient medical thought documented by Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Tertullian, long hair had a special meaning. Those authors believed that long hair was an extension of the female reproductive system, a prolongation of fertility. If a woman let down her hair while bowing her head in prayer, it was thought that this could arouse desire in the angels. Paul, when writing about veils, was actually making direct reference to Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 and to the fall of the Watchers. He was warning the women of Corinth that certain practices could attract the unwanted attention of fallen spiritual beings. That warning implies that Paul believed that fallen angels remained active and present in the world of his time, not as a past historical threat, but as a spiritual reality with which believers had to remain cautious. That third theory, known as the repopulation theory, holds that fallen angels acted again after the flood. The same watchers or beings similar to them united again with human women and fathered a new generation of Nephilim. This would explain why the giants appeared again in Canaan centuries after the waters of the flood receded. The Bible does not confirm it explicitly in a single passage, but multiple texts point in that same direction. The Damascus document, Paul's letters, and the book of Genesis together form a coherent and disturbing picture. The angels did not learn their lesson with the flood or simply chose to ignore it and repeat the forbidden act. And the result was the reappearance of the Nephilim in the Promised Land, exactly when the Israelites arrived to claim it. That encounter between the Israelite spies and the giants of Canaan was not a narrative accident or a simple literary device. It was the reflection of a much older and deeper spiritual war that began before the first human being existed. The three hypotheses, that of the Nephilim in the ark, that of the regional flood, and that of the angelic repopulation, have their strengths. None of them can be completely discarded in the light of the available texts, and each illuminates a different angle. The first is dramatic, but unlikely. The second is linguistically coherent, but theologically uncomfortable for many. The third is the one that best fits with the set of scattered textual evidence throughout the scriptures and ancient sources. What is certain, beyond all doubt, is that the Bible itself affirms the return of the Nephilim without offering a direct explanation. That silence of the sacred text has been a source of debates, studies, and fascination from biblical times to the present. It is not a mistake or a careless omission, but perhaps an invitation to deepen into the texts with more rigor. And the story of the Nephilim does not end with their reappearance in Canaan, nor with the victory of the Israelites over the giants. The narrative of those colossal beings of supernatural origin continues to unfold throughout the entire Old Testament. Each battle, each conquest, each confrontation between Israel and the giant peoples is part of a vaster conflict. A conflict that, according to some interpretation, culminates in a definitive confrontation with a figure that would change history. The Nephilim, those beings who survived the greatest cataclysm in human history, left an indelible mark in the sacred texts, in the traditions of ancient peoples, and in the mysteries that scholars even today try to solve. The question is not only how they survived the flood, but what role they played in the great story of humanity and the divine, and the answer could reveal something about human origins that no religious tradition has told with full clarity. The apocryphal texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Paul's writings together form a map of the same territory, a territory inhabited by beings who existed on the border between the human and the divine. Between the visible and the invisible, that border, according to the oldest texts, was not destroyed by the flood, but simply redrawn in another place. The Watchers of Heaven, called so in the Qumran manuscripts, did not cease to exist when the waters rose. They continued observing, waiting, and according to some sources acting upon the human world in ways that the Bible insinuates. The Book of Enoch, although non-canonical, is quoted in Jude's epistle itself, which gives it an authority difficult to ignore. In that text, the process by which the Watchers made the decision to descend and unite with women is described in detail, and it is narrated how that decision was irreversible, sealing the destiny of those angels and their gigantic descendants. But if the decision was irreversible for the original Watchers, what prevented other angels from making the same decision? Nothing. According to the repopulation theory, nothing, except the divine will that Paul seemed to want to protect with his advice. That is why he recommended women of Corinth to cover themselves, not for cultural modesty, but for a deep spiritual reason. He was warning about a threat that, according to his worldview, remained real and present in the world of his era. That continuity between the ancient biblical world and the world of the New Testament is precisely what makes this story unique. The Nephilim are not just an exotic element of the book of Genesis, but a narrative thread that runs through the entire Bible. From Genesis to the prophets, from the Psalms to the apostolic letters, their shadow is projected in different ways. King Og of Bashan, mentioned in Deuteronomy, was the last of the Rephaim, another name linked to the lineage of the giants. Goliath, the Philistine warrior struck down by David, belonged, according to the scriptures, to a family of giants in Gath. Each of those figures is an echo of the original Nephilim, a remnant of that lineage that the flood failed to extinguish, and each victory of Israel over those giants has a meaning that goes beyond the military history of an ancient people. They are battles in a deeper conflict that began in the heavens and manifested on earth through generations. That conflict has its own rules, its own actors, and its own logic that the biblical narrative exposes gradually. As the centuries advance and the books of the Old Testament succeed one another, the pattern becomes increasingly visible. The giants always appear in the path of the chosen people, as if their presence obeyed a superior purpose. A conflict that, according to the most daring interpretations of the sacred texts, has not yet reached its final conclusion. The story of the Nephilim is Ofuaresor, and at heart, the story of a violated border and of the consequences that violation produced. It is the story of what happens when the cosmic order is challenged and the consequences of that challenge propagate in time. It is also a reminder that the sacred texts keep layers of meaning that go far beyond a superficial reading, and it is also the story of a God who responded to that challenge with the most powerful instrument at his disposal, the flood. But if the Nephilim returned, then the battle did not end with the waters, and the story continues unfolding before us. What the flood could not definitively extinguish poses a question that no generation has been able to ignore completely. Does any presence of that lineage still exist in the world, or did their history finally come to its end with the passing of centuries? That story has a final chapter that most readers of the Bible never connect with the giants of Genesis. A chapter that involves a figure of whom both the Old and the New Testament speak with increasing intensity. A chapter in which the Nephilim cease to be the protagonists to become the backdrop for something greater. The Nephilim, those beings who challenged the divine order before the flood and did so again after, had an end. And that end did not come by another flood or by another natural catastrophe. But in a way that no Nephilim could have anticipated, there is something deeply unsettling in the idea that these beings arisen from the most extreme transgression had a destiny that, according to the text, was designed before the first angel made the terrible decision to descend. The complete story of the Nephilim is one of the most fascinating, disturbing, and forgotten narratives in the entire Bible. And if you have come this far, you know that the surface has barely been scratched and that there is much more to discover and understand. If you want to know how the story of the Nephilim ends and what it has to do with the greatest mystery of the New Testament, subscribe.